Hello again, everybody. Welcome to Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum and site of the latest virtual field trip. Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to look at an exhibit that we've really never talked about in depth, and we're going to specifically talk about the three players represented in that exhibit. It is the Character and Courage exhibit, and the three players, Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, and Roberto Clemente. We do welcome you to the program. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markusen. I work in the education department here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. We are broadcasting from the Bud Selig Center, located in the Hall of Fame's library. This program, like all the other virtual programs that we do, made possible through the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. So we do thank Ford Motor Company for giving us the support, enabling us to do these great programs without having to charge you. And that is certainly a good thing. Today, we will focus on character and courage here at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. Now, for those of you that have ever been to the Hall of Fame in the recent past, I'm going to say last 15 or so years, when you first come to the Hall of Fame and you enter the lobby, you see statues for three men: Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, and Roberto Clemente. And those three statues, they do comprise our Character and Courage exhibit. Not only are these three Hall of Famers, and obviously their statistics speak an awful lot on their own, but beyond that, these were three men of strong character, incredibly strong character. They really became heroic figures for a variety of reasons. Lou Gehrig, whose statue is seen on the left, handled his diagnosis of ALS with grace and dignity, and he remained optimistic about his life and appreciative for his past success in the game. In the middle, we have Jackie Robinson's statue. He, of course, is a civil rights pioneer, broke the color barrier with tremendous success in 1947. And it was because of that success that other Black players soon followed from the Negro Leagues. And then on the right, we have the statue of Roberto Clemente, humanitarian who lost his life while trying to airlift earthquake relief supplies to the devastated country of Nicaragua. And sadly, in the process of doing that, lost his life at the age of 38. So these are the three statues made of bronze. We'll talk a little bit more about the artist that sculpted these three and how long this exhibit has been here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. We'll do that a little bit later on in the program. But most of our focus is going to be on these three men themselves. Each of them tragically lived relatively short lives. Lou Gehrig died from the effects of ALS, only 37. Roberto Clemente, killed in a plane crash, all of 38 years of age. And even Jackie Robinson was not that old either. He was only 53 when he passed away from the effects of diabetes, which led to a fatal heart attack. So all three taken from us really far too soon, and yet they accomplished such a great deal in their short time on this earth, establishing themselves as leaders, role models, and as heroes. We're going to take them in chronological order, and also as they appear in the exhibit from left to right. So we will begin with the Iron Horse, Lou Gehrig. When we mention his name, one of the first things that comes to mind is his great character. Now, character is one of those words that we sometimes throw around a little too loosely and maybe don't exactly define it properly. We're going to try to define it first by what are sometimes known as the guiding principles to character, and there are 12 of them. And we're going to see during the course of his short life, Lou Gehrig showed each of these 12 guiding principles. Accountability, player that never made excuses for the few failures that he had. Compassion for others, particularly teammates. Contemplation, a man who thought things through. when he was first offered a contract to sign with the New York Yankees. He didn't say yes right away, consulted with his parents, his advisor at college, at Columbia, really contemplated the situation. Certainly a man of courage, bravery, a man of honesty, somebody that had tremendous initiative. You know, here's someone who was given a scholarship to play college football at an Ivy League school, Columbia University. But he wasn't satisfied just to do that, you know, to fulfill his scholarship, to have his tuition paid for him. All he had to do was play for the varsity football team, but he wanted to play baseball too. He loved baseball. He knew he was good at it. And it was playing baseball that drew the attention of the New York Yankees and a scout named Paul Critchell. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Then you have loyalty, certainly showed loyalty to his managers, to his teammates, was never one to publicly criticize any of them, always supported his teammates, his coaches, his managers. Someone who had tremendous optimism, even in the face of that awful diagnosis of ALS, when he received that back in 1939. Perseverance, something that we see from many heroic figures in American history. It's not always easy. There are obstacles placed in front of them. Certainly that was the case with Clemente, and yet he persevered. Respect for his teammates, respect for his family, respect for his wife, Eleanor. A sense of responsibility. I mean, when you play 2,130 consecutive games without missing a single game, certainly a responsibility. And that ties in with trustworthiness as well, as trustworthy a teammate as you could find with the New York Yankees in the 1920s and 30s. Now, there are other character traits, other words we can use to describe someone of good character, but these are what we call the 12 guiding principles to character. And we certainly saw all of these during the life of Lou Gehrig. Here we see a picture of Lou Gehrig when he was very young. It's a picture that's not often seen or talked about. Lou Gehrig was born in New York City. He was the lone surviving son of two immigrants from Germany, his father Heinrich, his mother Christina. Something that's not really well known, when Lou was a young boy, and really before this picture was even taken, he was somewhat on the clumsy side. He was awkward. And this actually led to him being teased and bullied by other children. I was really surprised when I first learned about that, because, you know, when you look at Lou Gehrig, the pictures of him as an adult, he was this, you know, very handsome, strong guy. He looked, you know, like Mr. All-American in so many ways, and certainly had that incredible character that we've talked about. And yet, when he was younger, he had to go through something that a lot of kids have to go through. Bullying, being teased, being mocked by others. But he was able to find a way to overcome it. One of the ways that he did was through his athletic prowess. As young Lou grew older and taller and more athletic, he found his niche as a tremendous athlete, accomplished not only at baseball, but also in football. Here we see a picture of him playing tailback. As a 12-year-old, going back to this photo for just a moment, Lou was a very talented ball player and a star for his team, the Reservoir Ovals. They were an amateur team. And in 1916, they actually won the New York City Playground Championship. Lou Gehrig was obviously the star of the team, a very important part of that team's success. But it was his football playing ability in high school that really drew the attention of a college, and that was the Ivy League school, Columbia University. After Lou completed his high school years, he received a football scholarship to attend Columbia University, right in his hometown of New York City. This allowed him to stay close to his parents. Now, his parents, they were not wealthy people. They were immigrants who had settled into New York City. Life economically was often a struggle for them. They certainly could not have afforded the tuition to go to a fine Ivy League school like Columbia. So to have the tuition taken care of in the form of the college football scholarship was a huge thing. By the way, Lou's mother, Christina, worked as a cook at Columbia. And during his time in college, Lou worked as a waiter in order to earn extra money for the family. And that's something we're going to see as kind of a common theme throughout his life. Lou never forgot his roots, never forgot his family, always went back to taking care of his family, particularly his mother, Christina. Now, at Columbia, Lou played football, which was required as part of the scholarship, but he also wanted to play baseball, the sport that, well, that would turn out to be his true strength as an athlete. He was a very fine football player, obviously, but even more talented in baseball. And it was while playing baseball at Columbia that he caught the attention of a man named Paul Critchell. The day was April 26, 1923. Critchell, the top scout for the New York Yankees, was at Columbia that day and happened to watch Gehrig play ball. And he was very impressed with what he saw from Gehrig on the field. He then interviewed Gehrig, talked to him after the game, was very impressed by how polite and respectful Gehrig was. Gehrig addressed Critchell as sir, was very polite in the way that he responded to the questions. And as it turned out, he was offered this large monetary bonus. It was, I'm sure, very tempting for Gehrig to say yes right at the moment, to go play for the New York Yankees, at the time the most famed team in the major leagues. But he told Critchell that he wanted to think about it. He wanted to consult his parents, maybe talk to some of his teachers in school, his advisor, get a sense of what the right thing to do would be. And as it turned out, after consulting with all these people and looking at the pros, looking at the cons of leaving Columbia early and signing with the Yankees, well, that's exactly what he decided to do. Now, even though Lou, in his early years with the Yankees, had already begun to establish himself as a star first baseman, he certainly did not act like one. We did not see the stereotypical large ego develop as the result of his early success. No, Lou Gehrig maintained his down-to-earth nature, even as he was enjoying these remarkable successes early in his Yankee career. He did remain close to his family, particularly to his mother, Christina, shown in this great photograph here. So here we have Lou Gehrig, celebrity, one of the best known players in all of baseball, he's a star athlete. And here he's in his mother's kitchen helping her do the dishes after dinner. It's just a great, great photo, and it does give you a sense of how grounded Lou Gehrig was. Success never seemingly went to his head. He always maintained his roots, grounded, always remembered exactly where he had come from, the background, and the importance that his parents had played, particularly his mother, Christina. And he knew that it was important to repay that debt every opportunity that he had. By the way, his mother had worked several jobs during Lou's childhood just to make ends meet. And it was because of her working all those jobs that Lou had instilled in him many of these hard working values. You talk about athletes with a work ethic. None developed any stronger a work ethic than the great Lou Gehrig. Here we have a terrific photograph of Lou with his mother, Christina, on the left, his father, Heinrich, on the far right. And then in between Lou and his father is the young woman, Eleanor, that Lou would marry. After Lou began his Yankee career, started to establish himself as a star, he met his wife, her name, Eleanor Twitchell, with whom he developed a strong and lasting bond. They married in 1932. Here at the Hall of Fame, we have this bracelet that you see on the right side of your screen. This was donated by Eleanor Gehrig in the early 1940s. It was a bracelet that Lou had given to her for their 4th anniversary. It was their anniversary gift. And it's very interesting. This bracelet, which is currently on display on the museum's 2nd floor, it actually is made of the medals commemorating the World Championships that Lou won, his All-Star Game appearances, other great accomplishments in baseball. So he took all these medals and pins and he had them fashioned by a jeweler to create this beautiful bracelet that he gave to Eleanor for their 4th wedding anniversary. And as I said, the bracelet is now on display. It's in the timeline of baseball history up on the 2nd floor of the museum. Now, Teresa Wright, the famous actress who played Eleanor Gehrig in the 1942 film Pride of the Yankees, actually wore this bracelet during the filming of the movie. The bracelet then went back to Eleanor, and you can see Eleanor in the great picture on the left. Her and Lou are enjoying some vacation time on the Atlantic Boardwalk there. And then after Lou's passing, Eleanor did donate that bracelet along with a number of other personal items that are now part of the personal collection that we have here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. In terms of on-the-field accomplishments, Lou is always best remembered for the 2,130 consecutive games that he played. But as you look back at that streak, it's really amazing that he was able to forge such a streak given the many injuries that he suffered. For example, during a game in 1934, Lou was hit in the head by a pitch, and he was actually knocked unconscious for a short period of time. He was taken to a hospital, and there the doctor informed Gehrig that he had a concussion, but Lou wanted to play. He did not want to stay in the hospital, not even for one night. And he kept telling his doctor that it was important for him to get back to the team. He felt loyalty to the team. The team needed him. Of course, we have to remember that back at this period of time, early 1930s, concussions were not as well studied and well researched as they are today. Even medical professionals did not fully understand the negative impact that concussions could have. If something like this happened today, well, there's a mandatory 7-day waiting period. If a player in the major league suffers a concussion, he has to sit out 7 consecutive days at the minimum, at the absolute minimum. So that's actually an obstacle to putting together an incredible playing streak under today's rules, but it certainly makes sense from a medical and safety standpoint. Doctors didn't know that, that 7-day or whatever the prescribed rest period would be. They didn't know about the importance of that. And they did not, mandate that Gehrig stay. They did not insist that he stay in the hospital. So as it turned out, he ended up leaving the hospital early and was able to maintain that consecutive game streak. In spite of obstacles like being hit by pitches, and we know that he was hit by several pitches, more than once in the head. He played in an era prior to helmets. Yet he continued to play. He compiled the streak, 2,130 consecutive games played. It was a record that stood until broken by another Hall of Famer, Cal Ripken Jr., in 1995. One of the amazing stories that I've read about Gehrig over the years is after he passed away, there was a medical exam done, and his hands were examined, and they found multiple fractures in both of his hands, some involving very small bones in his hands, but very painful fractures. Anybody who's ever broken a bone in the hand knows exactly what I'm talking about. And he suffered more than a dozen of these small fractures. And yet he never allowed that to keep him out of the lineup. He just allowed these breaks, these fractures to heal on their own, and he continued to play and play and play. Now, his play did start to suffer during the course of the 1938 season. That was really the first off year of his career in many ways. And then in 1939, he struggled even more profoundly. His play was suffering. He continued to work. He continued to put in extra batting practice, extra fielding practice, but nothing that he did could rectify his suddenly declining play. Now, some felt, well, this is just the natural aging process for a player. Others thought that the wear and tear of all those consecutive games had finally taken a toll, but there was an underlying problem, a far more serious problem that was going on. Finally, it got to a point in 1939 where his wife Eleanor convinced Lou that he needed to go to the doctor. And they actually set up an appointment for him to travel to the Midwest to see medical specialists at the famed Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And after a series of tests that took place over the course of several days, the doctor informed Lou that he had ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. We know it today, obviously a very serious disease that affects the muscles and the nerves. It was a disease that publicly few people had heard of back in 1939. Certainly doctors knew about it, medical science knew about it, but research into it was very much in the young stages. There was very little known about it, and there was almost nothing in terms of treatment. We still don't have a cure to this day, although treatments have certainly helped some people and certainly have extended the lives of some ALS victims. Here's the part of the story that is somewhat of a mystery to this day. We know the doctor told Lou that he had ALS. We know that he told him that he couldn't play anymore. He'd have to retire as a player. We also know that the doctor made an impression on him that this was a serious disease. But we're not 100% sure if he told Lou that it was fatal, that it was going to get much worse, and that ultimately was going to shorten his life. As it turned out, he would live only 2 more years after the diagnosis. We're not really sure of any of that. We don't know how forthright, how truthful the doctor was. We don't know if he gave him the entire story or perhaps tried to give him some sense of hope, false hope, as it might have been. But we do know that Lou Gehrig, shortly after receiving this word, was honored. Lou Gehrig Day at Yankee Stadium was on the 4th of July. And in spite of the disturbing diagnosis, the fact that his career had come to an end, and perhaps, again, not sure, but perhaps knowing somewhere in the back of his mind that this was going to cut his life short, nobody knew by how long, he was able to make the following comments. And they are remarkable given the dreaded diagnosis that he had just received. And we're actually going to read to you that entire speech that he delivered, beginning with the first words that he spoke. Fans, for the past 2 weeks, you have been reading about the bad break I got. Yet today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. If you've ever seen the movie Pride of the Yankees with Gary Cooper, you know that the way they depict that speech on television or in the film, this is depicted as the final words of his speech. He then walks away from the microphone. In actuality, this was the beginning of his speech. Those famous words, yet today I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. It actually came at the beginning of his speech before this crowd of 60,000 plus people at Yankee Stadium. He went on to say a lot of other things during that talk, that speech. I've been in ballparks for 17 years and have never received anything but kindness and encouragement from you fans. Look at these grand men. Which of you wouldn't consider it the highlight of his career just to associate with them for even one day? Sure, I'm lucky. Who wouldn't consider it an honor to have known Jacob Rupert, also the builder of baseball's greatest empire, Ed Barrow, to have spent 6 years with that wonderful little fellow, Miller Huggins, then to have spent the next 9 years with that outstanding leader, that smart student of psychology, the best manager in baseball today, Joe McCarthy. Sure, I'm lucky. When the New York Giants, a team you would give your right arm to beat and vice versa, sends you a gift, that's something. When everybody down to the groundskeepers and those boys in white coats remember you with trophies, that's something. When you have a wonderful mother-in-law who takes sides with you in squabbles with her own daughter, that's something. When you have a father and a mother who work all their lives so you can have an education and build your body, it's a blessing. When you have a wife who has been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you dreamed existed, that's the finest I know. So I close in saying that I may have had a tough break, but I have an awful lot to live for. Now, just as a point of clarification, we'll go back and clarify some of these references. Jacob Ruppert was the owner of the Yankees. Ed Barrow was the team's general manager. Miller Huggins, a reference to one of Gehrig's earlier managers, Joe McCarthy, his later manager with the Yankees. He also makes this rather strange reference to the boys in white coats. What I've been able to gather from that is he's talking about the men who were working in concessions at Yankee Stadium, maybe doubling as security in a sense as well. But I believe the boys in white coats was a specific reference to the men who would sell concessions items at the ballpark. And you'll notice how many different people and groups of people he tries to mention. He talks very little about himself. He talks mostly about everybody else and how everybody else made his life so much easier and so much better. He talks about his mother-in-law, of course, talks about his wife, Eleanor. And it's just a remarkable speech. It's still the most famous speech I have ever seen delivered, either by a baseball player, a manager, coach, executive. It's just remarkable. But this was what he said, and it was said from the heart. It's just an amazing conversation or amazing speech that he gave at Yankee Stadium that day. Now, Lou could no longer play the game. He wanted, though, to make sure that his life continued to be meaningful. He actually took a job with the city of New York. The job was to work with young men who had been paroled from prison. He would sit down with them. He would give them advice. He would try to get them on a straight and narrow course, try to just give them some help, some insights to get their lives going in the right direction. And that was what he did for the better part of the next 2 years until he reached a point where he simply could not work anymore. And then, of course, we did lose him June 2nd, 1941, and he was only 37 years of age. Just a few weeks ago, you may have heard Major League Baseball's announcement that it would celebrate each June the 2nd as Lou Gehrig Day. June 2nd does mark the anniversary of his passing back in 1941. And we're going to be doing a special program exclusively on Lou Gehrig, one of these virtual programs on that day as well, coming up on June 2nd. So those are some of the accomplishments, some of the many accomplishments of Lou Gehrig. We now move on to the story of Jackie Robinson. Jack Roosevelt Robinson was born January 31st, 1919 in Cairo, Georgia, the youngest of 5 children. He and his family moved to Southern California in 1920 when he was only a year old. By then, Robinson's father had already left the family, so he was now essentially raised by his mother, Mally. Robinson and his family lived in a neighborhood that had mostly white residents. Robinson and his family often bombarded with insults, racially motivated comments. Sometimes the neighbors actually called the police on the Robinsons to report them having done something inappropriate or criminal, even though they actually had done nothing wrong. Now, thankfully, over time, the relationship with the neighbors became better. Some of them finally began to accept a Black family in the neighborhood, although it certainly did take a while for that to occur. In high school, Jackie Robinson emerged as a top flight athlete. Athletics also gave him an opportunity to make friends with some of his white classmates. After attending Pasadena Junior College, Robinson's athletic abilities earned him a scholarship to the University of California at Los Angeles. We know it better as UCLA, a very fine school. He lettered in 4 different sports: basketball, football, track and field, and of course, baseball. This was actually a bit surprising, but In college, Robinson was considered by some to have been better as a football player than he was as a baseball player. It's pretty amazing. Now, Robinson attended UCLA for 3 years through his junior year. And then he decided to leave at that point because of family obligations. His family needed money, needed financial support, and he felt that he could not afford to go to college for another year. Instead, he wanted to go into business to earn money for his family. But then came an interruption to that, and that was service in World War II. In 1942, Robinson was drafted into the United States Army. And here we see a great photograph of a still very young Jackie Robinson in his military uniform. Robinson certainly served with distinction during the Second World War. He never saw combat, but did become a lieutenant here in the U.S. Army, served stateside. And it was while serving in the Army that he became involved in a racially charged incident. It's an incident that a lot of people who follow baseball and study Jackie Robinson know about, but it's an incident that a lot of other people don't know about. And for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to get the publicity and attention that it should. And it was actually something very similar to what happened to Rosa Parks roughly a decade later. Now, in 1955, Rosa Parks made history when she refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a public bus. She was arrested, charged with a crime, even though she had done absolutely nothing wrong. She was generally treated very poorly by the justice system in Montgomery, Alabama, where she lived. Her plight gained attention locally and then nationally. And eventually, over time, it led to some changes. It led to the desegregation of the Montgomery, Alabama bus system. We certainly regard Rosa Parks to this day as an incredibly important figure in the civil rights movement, a civil rights pioneer without question. Well, 11 years before this incident, 11 years prior, 1944, Jackie Robinson did something eerily similar to Rosa Parks. He had boarded a military bus, and he was dressed somewhat like he is in this photograph, with his full military colors, his lieutenant's uniform. It was obvious that he was an officer in the army at this time. There's an empty seat in the front of the bus, so Robinson sits in the empty seat. But the bus driver was looking to make trouble, unfortunately. And he confronted Robinson. He said, "No, you cannot sit in the front. You're black. You've got to sit in the back of the bus." Robinson tried to point out to the driver that he's an officer in the Army. This is a military bus. He should have the right to sit wherever there's an empty seat. He wasn't taking anybody else's seat. He wasn't forcing anybody out of their seat. He was simply sitting in an available empty seat in the front of the bus, a military bus. Well, the driver remained unsympathetic, actually was able to summon police, and he had Robinson charged with a crime. And this was taken seriously enough that it went to military tribunal, military court. And there, Robinson was found not guilty on all the charges. It turned out that the case against him was, well, not even frivolous. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was baseless. He had done absolutely nothing wrong. He was completely in the right. So he was found not guilty on all the charges. So here we have a classic example of baseball not just following the civil rights movement, as we hear so often, but actually being a leader in the civil rights movement. Here is this young man after 3 years of college where he's a standout athlete. He's in the military, and he's challenged on racial grounds here, challenged obviously in one of the most unfair ways that you could be challenged. And instead of, bending to the law, bending to the whims of a bigot, he stood up for his own personal right. So he really did become a leader in the civil rights movement. And it was really stories like this, accomplishments like this, that drew the attention of Branch Rickey, shown here in this great photograph when Jackie Robinson signs his first contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Branch Rickey was the part owner and general manager of the Brooklyn franchise. He wanted to end the color barrier, which had been in place since 1887 in baseball. He wanted to replace it on two grounds. First of all, he thought it was morally wrong. He didn't agree with it from a moral standpoint. But second, he had a practical concern as well. He felt that if he would be able to go out and sign the best black players, and other teams in the National League did not, that would give him a distinct advantage. That would make his team better while the other teams essentially stagnated. So Branch Rickey became very determined to end the color barrier, which, as I said, had been in place since the mid-1880s. During the 1945 season, Rickey dispensed with one of his scouts, a longtime baseball man named Clyde Sukeforth, and he wanted Sukeforth to go watch Robinson play shortstop in the Negro Leagues for the Kansas City Monarchs, great Negro Leagues team. As it turned out, Robinson did not play. I believe he was injured that day, but Sukeforth did have a chance to meet with him after the game, and he talked to him for quite a while. And he came away highly impressed with Robinson's personality, his character. He felt like this was a compelling individual on many different grounds. And when he reported back to Rickey, he had to admit that he didn't see him play because he didn't play that day. But in terms of other things, in terms of his character, integrity, the type of person that he was, he could certainly give Robinson a glowing recommendation. It was based largely on the Sukeforth recommendation that Branch Rickey signed Jackie to his first contract later in 1946. In 1946, he played in the minor leagues for the Brooklyn Dodgers' top affiliate, the Montreal Royals. And then, of course, he moved up to the major leagues in 1947. Now, in talking to Jackie about what it was like to be this player who was going to break through the color barrier, he warned him about how difficult it was going to be, how he was going to be targeted, he was going to be insulted, he was possibly going to receive threats on his life. People were going to try to pick fights with him. He tried to prepare Robinson as well as he could. And among the comments that he made were this: Branch Rickey talking to Jackie Robinson, "We'll be in a tough position. We can win only if I convince the world that I'm doing this because you're a great ball player and a fine gentleman. If you're a good enough man, you can make this a start in the right direction. But let me tell you, it's going to take an awful lot of courage." Branch Rickey, in assessing that Jackie Robinson was the right man to break the color barrier, wasn't picking Robinson because he necessarily thought he was the best player in the Negro League. Certainly he was one of the best players, but he was essentially a rookie in the Negro Leagues. There were other players who were far more experienced, far more proven, and had longer track records. But Robinson presented the entire package: a talented young player, but he had all these other qualities: college educated, military background, military discipline, a guy who could present himself very well when he was interviewed by the press, a guy that had the character not to fight back despite being goaded, something that inevitably was going to happen. So on opening day, 1947, Jackie Robinson made his major league debut. It was April 15th, made his debut for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, that season turned out to be a very good season for Robinson. He would win Rookie of the Year. He would help the Dodgers win the National League pennant. But there were many obstacles. Initially, during spring training, some of his Dodger teammates, they told management they wanted no part of playing with a black man. Some opponents shouted insults at him. For example, there were pitchers who intentionally threw inside, sometimes up in the direction of Robinson's head, because they wanted to hurt him. They did not want to play against a black player. When Robinson played second base, which was one of many positions he could play first, second, third. He could even fill in at shortstop. He could play the outfield. He played all these positions during his career. But when he played second base, he was sometimes spiked intentionally by a runner coming in with his spiked side. They would try to cut him with their spiked shoes. As bad as all this was, consider the hate mail that he received. Now, this was a letter that was not sent to him his rookie year in 1947, but it was sent later on in his career. And I'm going to read it to you. It's a pretty shocking letter, but I think it's important to get a sense of what Robinson was facing. So here we have this letter. Note, we have already got rid of several like you. One was found in river just recently. The letter goes on to say, Robinson, we are going to kill you if you attempt to enter a ball game at Crosley Field. Signed, the Travelers. The Travelers, not a lot is known about them. It appears they were a racist organization located in the Midwest. I guess you might say they were a smaller offshoot or version of the KKK. But clearly this is a death threat. The first part of the letter hints that there's going to be trouble, talking about the body being found in the river just recently, clearly the body of a black man. And then, as if that's not clear enough, the letter goes on to just implicitly say, we're going to kill you if you enter this ball game at Crosley Field, the home of the Cincinnati Reds. And you have to wonder what was going through Robinson's mind when he got letters like this. Baseball's hard enough to play under normal circumstances. When you're playing with the death threat looming, thinking that there might be someone in the ballpark that wants to do harm to you, it's amazing that Robinson was able to put that out of his mind and continue to play. But he was not one to give in to the haters or the bigots. And he played. He insisted on playing. He kept playing. Thankfully, the Travelers never followed through on this threat. Nothing came of it. But this kind of thing happened on a regular basis. Robinson received hate letters like this. So did Branch Rickey. And yet, in spite of such hatred, Robinson persevered. He continued. He won the National League Rookie of the Year, as I said, in 1947. In 1949, he was named the most valuable player. Led the Dodgers to numerous World Series appearances over the next decade, culminating in a World Championship in 1955. Now, as that 1947 season progressed, Robinson began to win over a good portion of the American public. They recognized him as a strong family man with good values. Many white Americans realized Robinson was just like them. He placed an emphasis on his family, his wife Rachel, their 3 children. Robinson became popular with fans both in Brooklyn and other locations. He became a national figure. He appeared on the covers of Time and Life magazines, magazines that were not sports magazines or general interest publications. And in a sense, he became a symbol of hope to millions of Americans, and especially to Black Americans who wanted the opportunity to either play the game in the major leagues or as fans to be able to watch Black Americans play the game. After retiring in 1956, Jackie remained very active in the civil rights movement. Just to highlight some of the things that he did, 1960, he became very involved in politics. He campaigned for presidential candidate Richard Nixon. He was then appointed special assistant to the governor by Governor Nelson Rockefeller. That was 1966. In 1968, he was named national chairman of the Brotherhood Week for the National Conference of Christians. He attended many protests, marches, sit-ins, delivered lectures about civil rights in many different locations. And I think one of the most fascinating things, he became a trusted advisor to Dr. Martin Luther King, the man who essentially led the American civil rights movement in the 1960s. Here is a famous photograph of these 2 men. We have this photograph blown up on display in our library, in our Giamatti Research Center next door. And we've got a great quote that we've put up next to the picture here. And here we have Dr. King. again, the leader of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, giving credit to a baseball player for making his job easier. This is what King said: Jackie Robinson made it possible for me in the first place. Without him, I would never have been able to do what I did. Here's Dr. King realizing, Jackie was older. Jackie had gone through experiences in the 1940s and 50s. And King wanted to draw from those experiences, draw from the wisdom that Robinson had compiled. As this civil rights pioneer, as this man who broke the color barrier, as this man who faced racism while in the military, and even going back to his days growing up in Southern California. So it's pretty amazing that Martin Luther King gives so much credit to Robinson. They became not only counselors to each other, but friends, and remained so until King's assassination in 1968. In September of 1962, here is what Robinson said during a conference in Birmingham when he was talking about Martin Luther King. Quote, "People used to tell me a lot of things about Dr. King, that he was trying to take over the world, that he was making money on the civil rights issues. I didn't believe them, of course. I knew this was a dedicated man and that he has made tremendous personal financial sacrifices in the cause. I sort of wondered why people would stoop to talk about him in such a way. Then I realized that the world has always talked against great men. The best way to keep from getting talked about is to do nothing." So that's what Robinson said about King. And their relationship became a critical aspect of the American civil rights movement. And as I like to tell, whenever I do our civil rights program with students across the country, I always like to say this: you simply cannot teach American history without teaching about Jackie Robinson, civil rights hero, civil rights pioneer. Here are some of the ways that Jackie's still represented here at the Hall of Fame. There is his plaque, which was redone back in 2008 at the request of his widow, Rachel. His initial plaque did not mention anything about what he did breaking through the color barrier, what he did for civil rights. Rachel Robinson asked that that be changed. So the entire plaque was rewritten. And then at the very end, the last sentence says, "Displayed tremendous courage and poise in 1947 when he integrated the modern major leagues in the face of intense adversity." And that is the plaque that currently hangs in the gallery. Among the artifacts that we have for him here, you can see one of his Brooklyn Dodger caps, showing a little bit of wear and tear from his playing days. And that is currently on exhibit in the second floor in our Ideals and Injustices exhibit. That's the exhibit that used to be known as Pride and Passion. So that is Jackie Robinson, some of his story. We now move on to Roberto Clemente. He was born on August 18th, 1934 in the small village of Carolina, Puerto Rico. His father worked as a sugarcane worker. His mother was a laundress. The Clementes were not what you would call outright poor, but with 8 children in the house, including Roberto, there was little money to spend outside of the basic necessities. At times, life economically could be a struggle for the Clementes. Now, as a young boy, Clemente and his friends, they didn't have the money to buy regulation baseball equipment like regular bats and balls. No, they had to improvise. They fashioned bats out of guava tree limbs, and they created makeshift baseballs out of crushed tin cans. Gives you an idea of just how much Clemente loved the game. He was not going to let the lack of basic equipment prevent him from playing. After starring in high school and then in the Puerto Rican Winter League, Clemente arrives at his first spring training with the Pirates, 1955. And rather infamously, a Florida headline writer referred to him as a Puerto Rican hot dog, certainly a bigoted statement. There was a stereotype, and I guess to some extent, the stereotype still exists to this day, maybe not as flagrantly as it once did. This whole idea of the Latin player being showboat, showing off, Certainly, Clemente was labeled with that. He didn't appreciate the sentiment, but he fought against it. Really, articles like this, headlines like this, right from the start, established the media as having this adversarial relationship with Roberto. He really grew to mistrust the media. One of the things that he did not like, we're going to explain coming up in a moment here. Clemente really faced bigotry on two fronts. One was because he was Latino. He was not born in the mainland United States. He was born in the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. So he was Latino on the one hand, but also he was Black. He had dark skin. And he often referred to himself as a double minority. So he faced bigotry on these two different fronts. Now, Clemente, like many other Latino players of the 1950s and 60s, spoke English with a rather significant Spanish accent. Many newspaper and magazine writers had a habit of phonetically quoting Clemente and other Latinos in their stories. Just to give you some examples, when a player like Clemente would say the word "this," the writer, when writing it out on paper, would spell it out "these," reflecting the accent. A word like "that" would be spelled out as "dat," D-A-T. And a word like "very" would be written as "berry," B-E-R-R-Y. And when you take an entire paragraph of someone's words and you kind of play this game, this phonetically quoting that player, that person, and then you look at it on paper and you read it, first of all, it's hard to get through it. It's hard to understand exactly what's being said. And then the impression that you get is that this person is not very intelligent and is not very well spoken. Clemente basically felt like the writers were mocking him for his inability to speak English with the proper Americanized accent. And he felt this practice of phonetically quoting him and other players, other Latino players. He felt this was done to intentionally make the Latino player look stupid when they were anything but. The argument that he made was, these writers who are doing this to us, they only speak English. They don't speak Spanish. But I speak Spanish very fluently, and I'm learning English every day. I'm not fluent in English, but I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, but I'm getting better. So here I have the ability to speak two languages. Most of these writers can only speak one, and yet they're portraying me as not being very intelligent. So you can see why Clemente and other players hated this, and Clemente railed against this. He talked about this publicly. Another practice that Clemente resented was the habit that some in the media had of calling him not by his first name, his given name, but by Americanizing him as Bob or Bobby. We see this on many of his Topps baseball cards. Now, when someone called him by one of these names, Clemente would try to correct that person. He would say, "That is not my name. My name is Roberto. I'm Spanish, I'm Latino, I'm from Puerto Rico. My name is not Bob, it's not Bobby." He did make one exception for the great broadcaster, Bob Prince, who once won the Ford C. Frick Award, the Hall of Fame's Broadcasting Award. Prince was a very close friend of Clemente's, and he had a habit of calling Clemente Bobby or even Robbie at times. And Clemente kind of let it go because he felt in the case of Prince's situation, Prince didn't mean any harm. He meant it affectionately. Prince was a friend of his. So he made the one exception for Bob Prince. But for other people, especially people who didn't know him or didn't know him well, he did not like being called Bob or Bobby or Robbie. He didn't care for any of those attempts at Americanization. Most of Clemente's baseball cards listed him as Bob. Even as late as 1969, you see the 69 card on the right side of your screen, that card refers to him as Bob. It was not until 1970 that we would see the Bob switch to Roberto, and it would remain like that through his final card in 1973. As a Latino ball player, Clemente was a huge part of the Pirates' success, helped them win a World Series in 1960. He also became a part of intriguing history, September 1st, 1971, when the Pirates started the first all-black lineup in Major League history. Clemente was in the lineup that day. There were 2 players from Panama, 1 from Cuba. There were 5 African Americans, including the great Willie Stargell. The Pirates won the game that day 10-7, but that's not really the important story. The important story is that roughly a month to 6 weeks later, basically this same Pirate team goes on to win the World Series. And they show what a fully integrated team could do, a team that not only white players, but also black players and Latino players, showed that a fully integrated team allowed to do its thing could win it all, could win a championship, which is ultimately the goal for any team. Clemente had an incredible World Series in 1971. He was named the MVP. And after the Pirates won that World Series, he was interviewed by Bob Prince on television. Prior to answering Prince's first question, Clemente made a point of addressing his parents. They were watching on television. They, of course, were Spanish speakers. They did not speak much English at all, being from an earlier generation. And by doing this, Clemente was really showing a sign of respect for his parents. He wanted to address his parents. He wanted to make sure that they could understand what he was saying, his respect and his love for them. But it was also a sign of his pride in being Puerto Rican. Clemente was very much a family man. He was a man who wanted his children to grow up in his native Puerto Rico. When the baseball season ended, he always returned from Pittsburgh to Carolina, his home in Puerto Rico, to be with his wife, Vera, and their 3 children. This was something that he did each and every winter. During the winters, Clemente staged free baseball clinics for underprivileged children in Puerto Rico. He refused to take money for the clinics. He simply wanted these kids whose families didn't have any money to pay for a clinic. He wanted the kids to have an opportunity to learn the game properly, to learn the fundamentals. And during the season, Clemente regularly visited Pittsburgh's Children's Hospital. He would visit kids who were seriously ill, in some cases terminally ill. And he did this without fanfare, no publicity at all. He wanted no media attention for what he was doing. After the 1972 season, Nicaragua suffered a devastating earthquake. Clemente had managed a team previously in Nicaragua. He remembered how well the people there had treated him. He wanted to do something to help those earthquake victims. He organized a shipload of relief supplies to Nicaragua, but then heard reports that many of these relief supplies were being stolen by the Nicaraguan military. So he decided to organize a plane load of supplies, and he insisted on being on the flight himself so as to ensure that the goods would get to the intended victims. Unfortunately, the plane that he went on was an aging DC-7 with a history of malfunctioning. The plane was also badly overloaded with cargo, and shortly after takeoff, the plane exploded and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. The accident killed all 5 men aboard the flight, including the 38-year-old Clemente. Here we can see one of the newspapers, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and the coverage that they gave to the story. This actually appeared in their January 2nd edition because the crash took place very late on New Year's Eve, 1972. Obviously, the news shocked fans in Pittsburgh, in his native Puerto Rico, and all across Major League Baseball. After Roberto's death, his widow Vera fulfilled one of his dreams by opening the Roberto Clemente Sports City in Carolina, Puerto Rico. He'd always wanted a place for kids to participate in sports without having to pay any cost, any price. And Vera made sure that that happened. Here are some of the Clemente-related artifacts on display in our Viva Baseball exhibit on the museum's 2nd floor. They include his first professional contract, which was completely in Spanish, a memorial record album, some photographs, his final Topps baseball card from 1973, and a Pirates number 21 uniform. That number was retired in a ceremony at Three Rivers Stadium in 1973. So Clemente, along with Robinson and Gehrig, the three essential components to our character and courage exhibit. It opened in 2008. It consists of the three statues, all made of bronze. They were created by a very accomplished artist, Stanley Bleifeld. And just to read to you what it says on the label that is at the base of this exhibit: Character and Courage, cast bronzes by Stanley Bleifeld, 2008. And here is what is written: becoming a Hall of Famer takes more than just a great baseball career. Off the field challenges and how those challenges are met reveal an inner character that serves men and women throughout their lives. The life experiences of Lou Gehrig, Jackie Robinson, and Roberto Clemente stand out above all. Each faced personal and social obstacles with strength and dignity that set an example of character and courage for all others to follow. One additional note we should make what you're aware of at the very end of this description is an acknowledgement of very generous donation by a man named Robert Crotty, who's been a big supporter of the Hall of Fame, and his monetary donation making our character and courage exhibit possible. So that's our program. Let's take some questions, because I know there have been a few questions that have come across in our chat room. So Martin wants to know, I know that Clemente and possibly Gehrig were admitted to the Hall of Fame without waiting the 5 years. Were there any other early entrants? So yeah, they were the two. Clemente normally would have had a 5-year waiting experience or waiting period. The Hall of Fame's board of directors decided to waive that given the tragic circumstances of his death. He died on New Year's Eve, 1972. The special election was held in March of 73. Clemente got around 94% of the vote, so he easily got past the 75% requirement. In Gehrig's case, it would have been a 3-year waiting period. It was a 3-year waiting period that existed back then. And that was waived because they knew that he was seriously ill. I guess there was some concern that he was going to pass away. They didn't know exactly when, but maybe figured within a couple of years, as it turned out to be. So they wanted to make sure that he could be elected to the Hall of Fame while he was still alive, while he could still appreciate the honor. So that 3-year waiting period was waived in his case. Let's see. Jonathan writes, you have mentioned Gehrig's concussions. I have heard a theory that Gehrig did not have ALS, but rather suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I shouldn't even try to pronounce that. Encephalopathy, I believe is how you say it. Is that a possibility? This is a question coming in from Jonathan. I've certainly seen the articles about that, Jonathan. There is some belief that the repeated head injuries that he suffered may have contributed, maybe a relationship to the ALS, maybe separate to the ALS. We really don't know. I think research is still ongoing in that area, but that certainly has been mentioned as a possibility. We know he was beamed several times. In other words, he was hit with pitch balls more than once. And we know that he didn't miss playing time. He didn't have a helmet either. Helmets had not yet come into the game. He played with a soft cap. So it's certainly possible that his head injuries contributed to his medical condition. It's been talked about. There seems to be a possibility. It's not 100% conclusive, but it's something we may learn more about in future years as they continue to study ALS. We have a question coming in from, I believe it's Brian. You mentioned Lou Gehrig's loyalty and dedication to his family. In the movie Pride of the Yankees, Lou is shown to leave college and sign with the Yankees because he needed money to pay for his mother's illness and hospitalization. Is that a true story? Brian, as far as I know, it is. I don't know specifically what her illness was. She needed some sort of surgery, some kind of operation. And apparently he took the bonus that he received from the Yankees, which I think was about $1,000, and he either used all of that or most of that bonus to pay for his mother's medical treatment. So yes, as far as I know, that is a true story, and it just shows you the kind of selfless person that Lou Gehrig was. Let's see. Final question from Glinda, one of our loyal fans. We know that Hank Aaron received death threats when chasing Babe Ruth's home run record, but he was also afforded some security guards. Was the option for security guards available to Jackie when he broke into Major League Baseball? As far as I know, there was no extra security hired by the Dodgers. That kind of thing just wasn't done. Whether it was a financial thing or they just didn't think about it, but that just wasn't the custom of the day, to hire extra security at the ballpark, to hire security specifically for a player. I mean, certainly Ricky and the Dodgers were aware of these threats coming in. They were concerned about it, but to my knowledge, they never actually hired an extra security person or a security person specifically to keep an eye on Jackie Robinson. That kind of thing just wasn't done the way it would be done for Hank Aaron in 1974 when he was closing in on the home run record of Babe Ruth. The Atlanta Braves hired a security guard for him, a man named Calvin Wardlaw. I believe he was a former police officer, and he would actually accompany Aaron to the ballpark. Those are great questions coming in on the chat. I want to thank all of you for those questions. We also want to thank the Ford Motor Company for their generous support of programs like these. We hope you've enjoyed our talk, Character and Courage, here at the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. The stories, the accomplishments of Jackie Robinson, Lou Gehrig, and Roberto Clemente. Thanks for being with us. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.